Nobody told you to do this. That's the part worth saying up front. There was no financial planner sitting across the table with a strategy, no parent who modeled the behavior, no class in school that ever explained what happens to money when you leave it alone long enough that it starts doing the work you used to do yourself. You stumbled onto it the way most people stumble onto the things that actually reshape their life. Sideways, by accident, chasing a number that bothered you enough to follow it somewhere. You're 29 now. You've been investing half your paycheck since you were 23. The people you grew up with are still trying to nail down a monthly budget. You're not having the same conversation anymore. This isn't a story about deprivation. It's a story about a decision most people in their 20s will never make. What it actually cost, what it's quietly building, and why the math underneath it deserves an afternoon of anyone's attention in their 20s. It starts with a number that wasn't yours yet. You were 22, finishing your final semester, and a professor in some business elective you'd taken just to fill a credit mentioned something offhand during a lecture on compound interest. You scribbled it in the margin of your notebook and didn't think about it again for half a year. He said a 22-year-old who invests $500 a month and never raises that amount will end up with more money at 65 than a 32-year-old investing $1,000 a month for the same stretch of years. Not a little more, substantially more, because of what a 10-year head start does when compound interest gets 4 decades to work with it. You wrote it down because it sounded wrong. You came back to it 6 months later because it was still nagging at you and you wanted to disprove it. You ran the numbers yourself on a free online compound interest calculator, which took about 15 minutes, and what you found wasn't wrong at all. If anything, it was more dramatic than the professor had let on. The 22-year-old putting in $500 a month from 22 to 65 at a 10% average annual return, roughly what the market has historically returned over long stretches, ends up with somewhere around $4.3 million. The 32-year-old putting in $1,000 a month from 32 to 65 at that same return ends up with about $3.1 million. The person contributing half as much every month, but starting a decade earlier, finishes with over $1 million more. You sat with that longer than felt normal, not because you had $500 a month to invest. You didn't yet, but because the math was pointing at something underneath the numbers that nobody had ever said to you directly. Time was the actual asset. Not income, not connections, not intelligence, not hustle in the way hustle usually gets glorified. Time, the one resource you had in abundance at 22, that no amount of money or effort could ever buy back once it was gone. That's the real starting point, not the savings rate, not the spreadsheet, not the brokerage account you'd open 3 months later. It was that specific, uncomfortable realization that the single most valuable financial asset you'd ever hold was already draining away and you hadn't started using it. Your first job out of college paid $48,000 a year in a mid-sized city in the Southeast. After taxes and your portion of health insurance, your take-home landed at around $3,050 a month. Half of that would have been $1,525. Rent on your apartment ran $890. That left $635 for everything else: food, transportation, your phone, any semblance of a social life. You didn't jump straight to 50%. You started at 20, which already felt aggressive to everyone around you, and which produced a monthly tightness you hadn't fully expected. You drove a 2008 sedan you'd bought for $6,200 cash the summer before graduation. You cooked at home most nights. You said no to things, not with dramatic speeches about financial independence, just quietly and consistently, in the way that builds a habit long before it builds a number. By month 8, you'd adjusted, not to having less money, but to needing far less than you'd assumed. That adjustment wasn't comfortable. It was just true. The things you'd assumed were necessary turned out to be mostly optional, and the things that actually were necessary cost less than the world around you kept insisting they should. There's a specific pressure that shows up in your mid-20s that nobody names out loud, but everybody feels. The pressure to appear like you're doing well. The apartment that signals you've arrived somewhere, the car that suggests you're not struggling. The dinners and the trips and the outfits that tell everyone your life is unfolding the way lives are supposed to at 24 or 25 or 26. Stepping outside that performance isn't free. It costs something social, something psychological, and no compound interest calculator accounts for that part. You paid the cost anyway. Some months it felt like the right trade. Some months it just felt like a cost. At 24, you got bumped to $54,000. You didn't upgrade the apartment, you didn't upgrade the car. You pushed your investment rate to 35% and felt the extra breathing room the way someone who's been walking with a pebble in their shoe finally feels the second they stop and shake it out. Not luxury, just less friction. At 25, you hit 50%, not because a rule told you to, but because the math you'd run at 22 kept resurfacing every time you thought about spending on something that didn't actually matter to you. 50% turned out to be the rate that, given your income and your real expenses, compressed the whole timeline into something that felt tangible instead of theoretical. Your closest friend from college is a woman named Jess. She's one of the sharpest people you know, smarter than you in most ways that count. And she's also the clearest example of what the default financial path looks like when a genuinely capable person walks it without ever questioning it. Jess graduated the same year as you. She took a marketing job at a consumer goods company in Chicago, paying $52,000, plus a signing bonus she used to furnish an apartment she was proud of. She financed a car on a 4-year loan because she needed something reliable, and the rate seemed fair. She had a great mid-20s, dinners, weekend trips, a social calendar that looked exactly like what you're supposed to have at 25, 26, 27. She put 6% into her 401k because that was the employer match threshold and the onboarding paperwork said that was the smart move. She wasn't reckless. She was living at the level her paycheck seemed to justify, which is what nearly everyone does when no one has ever given them a reason to do otherwise. The math underneath Jess's choices wasn't dramatic in any single month. 6% of a $52,000 salary comes out to about $260 monthly. Over 5 years with her employer match and a 7% average return, she'd built up roughly $23,000. A perfectly reasonable number if you don't compare it to anything else. Compare it to what $500 a month, starting at 22 turns into over that same 5 years. Roughly $35,000 without any employer match at all. And the gap is visible, though not yet devastating. The gap that actually matters isn't what things look like at 27. It's what they look like at 47. By 47, the person who started at 22 putting in $500 a month has a portfolio more than double the size of someone who started at 27 putting in $1,000 because 15 extra years of compounding isn't a linear edge, it's an exponential one. At 27, over coffee on a weekend visit to Chicago, she asked how much you'd saved. Not to compare herself, that's not who she is, but because she'd recently started paying closer attention to her own numbers, and something wasn't adding up the way she'd expected. You told her $87,000 in a brokerage account, $31,000 in a Roth IRA. She went quiet the way people do when they're running arithmetic in their head. Then she said, I've got $14,000 in my 401k and $2,000 in savings. She wasn't crushed, she was recalibrating. The look on her face was the same one you'd had at 22 staring at that calculator. The specific expression of someone realizing that a string of choices made without examination have been quietly adding up in a direction they never intended. You didn't lecture her. You didn't hand her a plan. You told her what the professor had said, you told her what the calculator had shown you, and you told her 27 wasn't late, that 27 with intention beats 35 with regret. Then you ordered another coffee and moved on to something else because that's what the moment called for. She bumped her contribution to 20% the following month. She texted you when she did it. It said, this felt like a lot until I actually ran the number. You knew exactly what she meant. The quiet stretch in the middle of this story is the part that doesn't make for compelling content. There's no dramatic turning point, no close calls, no big revelations. It's just a person in their mid-20s, in a city, with a job, making essentially the same decision in slightly different shapes, roughly 300 times a year. Whether to upgrade the apartment when the lease renewed, whether to buy the newer version of something that still worked fine, whether to say yes to a trip that didn't fit the budget, or say no without needing to explain yourself. The decision was almost always identical, not because you were rigid or joyless or incapable of spending money on things. But because you'd done the math and the math had permanently changed how you saw every single choice. When you looked at $200 for something you didn't need, you no longer saw $200. You saw $200 compounding at 10% annually for 40 years, which lands just above $9,000. Not every single time, but often enough that the decision basically made itself. Here's the thing about a high savings rate in your 20s that rarely gets explained well. It doesn't feel like sacrifice after that first year. It feels like clarity. The noise that spending generates, the low-grade anxiety of living right up against your income, the sensation of running in place that most people in their 20s treat as normal because everyone around them seems to feel it too. That noise fades out. Not because you suddenly have more money, but because you have more margin. And margin turns out to be a completely different kind of wealth than what shows up in a brokerage statement. By 27, your portfolio sat at $118,000. By 28, it was $162,000. The growth in that single year, $44,000, was larger than your entire portfolio had been worth 18 months earlier. You weren't contributing more. The money had started compounding at a rate that made your own contributions a shrinking slice of the total growth, which is exactly what compound interest looks like once it finally kicks into gear. Not a straight line climbing, a curve bending upward. You started checking the account less often than before, not out of indifference, but because checking had shifted from something that needed encouragement into something that felt like watching a well-built process run on its own, which doesn't require constant supervision once you trust it. Your life at 29 doesn't look remarkable from the outside. You still drive a similar kind of car? Your apartment is comfortable, nothing showy. You wear mostly the same brands you did at 23. You cook most nights, and there are a handful of things you spend freely on without any guilt. Good coffee, books, one carefully planned trip a year that you enjoy completely. What's invisible is the number. At 29, after 6 years of investing half your income, your portfolio sits at roughly $198,000. Not a retirement number. Not a figure that changes your day-to-day life right now. Not something anyone looking at your car or your apartment or your wardrobe would ever guess was sitting in an index fund with your name on it. But left alone, growing at an average of 8% a year for the next 36 years, with not another dollar added, it becomes roughly $3.2 million by the time you're 65. That's what 6 years of 50% produces at the far end of a long time horizon. Not the 6 years themselves, but the 36 years of silence afterward, during which the money simply does what money does once you stop interrupting it. Without another dollar added. And you're 29, you will add more dollars. You'll earn more, invest more, and the curve will keep bending the same direction it's been bending since you were 23 and opened a brokerage account with $300, feeling slightly foolish and slightly certain at the exact same time. There's a version of your life you didn't live. You know it well because you've watched it play out from the outside for 6 years. It isn't a bad life. It's the life most of your peers are living, and most of them are genuinely happy, and that happiness is real. It just has math underneath it that most of them haven't looked at yet. The car payment running $500 a month, which over 5 years, factoring in opportunity cost, works out closer to $36,000 in lost compounding. The apartment that costs $400 extra a month than it needs to, which over 6 years is $28,800, plus whatever that difference would have compounded into. The 6% contribution rate, because that's what the HR paperwork recommended. A rate that produces a comfortable retirement at 67, an anxious one at 55, and an impossible one at 45. None of those choices are wrong exactly. They're just choices made without running the math, and the math, once you do run it, doesn't tell you what to choose. It just tells you what each choice costs in time. And time is the only currency that truly matters in your 20s, the one that runs out whether you spend it or not. The question people ask most often when this comes up is what you gave up. People want to know what 50% actually cost you in lived experience. The honest answer is less than they assume. You traveled, you had a social life, you went to the concerts and dinners that actually mattered to you and skipped the ones that didn't, which you would have done regardless of your savings rate, because you've always been selective about how you spend your time. What you gave up was the unconscious spending, the purchases that happened by default simply because the option was there and the money existed, and not spending it required more effort than just spending it. You gave up the path of least resistance. In exchange, you got the curve. Jess is doing great. She's held at 20% for 2 years now, and her portfolio sits at 38,000 and climbing. In a way she describes as genuinely motivating rather than abstract. She recently sent you a screenshot of her compound interest projection with a message that simply read, "Okay, I get it now." You sent back a thumbs up because that was exactly the right response. Not because a thumbs up said everything, but because everything worth saying had already been said 2 years earlier over coffee in Chicago, and the number on her screen was saying the rest. The morning you looked at your portfolio and watched it cross 198,000, you were sitting at your kitchen table with a coffee before work. The number appeared, you looked at it for a moment, then closed the app and finished your coffee. Not because the number didn't matter, but because it mattered in a way that no longer required a reaction. The process was running. The curve was bending. The 22-year-old who ran the numbers on a free calculator because a professor said something that sounded wrong had turned out to be right about something he didn't even fully understand yet. Time was the asset. It still is. You have more of it right now than your portfolio does, which means the most important work is already behind you. What you do with the years between now and whenever you decide the number is enough is a question you haven't fully answered. Not because you don't think about it, but because the question of enough turns out to be harder and more honest and more worth sitting with than anything a compound interest calculator can tell you. You're still sitting with it. That feels right.